Imagine a world not just centuries, but tens of thousands of years ago. A world where vast sheets of ice, miles thick, sculpted continents, locked away immense volumes of water, and exposed lands now submerged beneath our oceans. This is where our story of America begins, long before any European ship touched its shores, long before the familiar names of continents existed. We are delving into deep time, into the earliest human presence on these lands, a story told not by written words, but by geology, archaeology, and ancient echoes. Our journey starts with a geographical marvel, Beringia. Not merely a bridge, but a vast, sprawling landmass, hundreds of miles wide, connecting what is now Siberia to Alaska. For millennia, during periods of glacial maximum, when so much of the Earth's water was frozen in colossal ice sheets, sea levels plummeted, revealing this fertile, unglaciated steppe. It was not a narrow strait, but a broad, habitable plain, teeming with life, mammoths, mastodons, woolly rhinos, ancient horses, and bison. And crucially, following these immense herds, came humans. These were the first Americans, not explorers in the sense of finding unknown lands, but nomadic hunter-gatherers, driven by the ebb and flow of ice ages and the migration patterns of the megafauna they depended on. The most widely accepted theory, the Beringia land bridge theory, posits that multiple waves of these ancient peoples crossed this landmass, slowly populating the Americas. Think of their existence. Constantly moving, intimately connected to the cycles of nature, mastering tools of stone and bone, always in pursuit of sustenance. Consider the challenges they faced. The landscape itself was unforgiving. Tremendous glaciers, such as the Laurentide ice sheet covering much of North America, and the Cordilleran ice sheet in the west, acted as formidable barriers for thousands of years. For a long time, the only accessible routes were coastal, or through narrow, ice-free corridors that periodically opened and closed. This slow, gradual southward migration over millennia, adapting to vastly different environments, from the Arctic plains of Beringia to the temperate forests and eventually the tropical regions of South America, speaks volumes about human adaptability and resilience. What evidence do we have of their presence? Archaeologists painstakingly pieced together this ancient past. The discovery of Clovis points in the 1930s revolutionized our understanding. These distinctive, fluted stone spear points, found across North America, were long considered the definitive signature of the earliest Americans, dating back approximately 13,500 years ago. Their widespread distribution suggested a rapid expansion of a single cultural group. Imagine the skill required to craft such a tool, its efficiency in hunting large game, its importance for survival. However, the story became more complex. Newer discoveries, pushing the timeline back even further, challenged the Clovis first model. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile, dating back over 14,500 years, provided compelling evidence of human occupation predating Clovis. This suggested either an even earlier migration, or perhaps a coastal migration route, where peoples navigated along the Pacific coast in primitive boats, bypassing the ice sheets altogether. Visualize these hardy individuals, hugging the coastline, utilizing marine resources, slowly pushing south. The sheer diversity of early American cultures also hints at multiple waves of migration and long periods of independent development. Before European arrival, North America alone was home to hundreds of distinct linguistic groups and myriad complex societies. The people who arrived via Beringia were not a monolithic group, but carried with them diverse cultural practices and adapted them to the new environments they encountered. Let's dwell on the daily life of these ancient hunter-gatherers. Their existence was intrinsically tied to the availability of resources. They lived in small, mobile bands, probably extended family groups. Their shelters were temporary, likely animal hide tents, brush shelters, or natural rock overhangs. Their diet was rich in protein from large game, supplemented by wild berries, roots, and nuts as they moved through different ecological zones. Tools were fashioned from stone, bone, wood, and antler, scrapers for processing hides, knives for butchering, awls for sewing. The creation of clothing from animal hides was essential for surviving the varying climates. Communication would have been entirely oral, stories and knowledge passed down through generations, often through elaborate rituals and practices linked to their natural environment and the animals they hunted. Their understanding of the natural world would have been profound, honed by thousands of years of observation and direct dependence. They were master trackers, skilled hunters, and intimately familiar with the flora and fauna of their territories. The transition from nomadic hunting to more settled lifestyles, and eventually to agriculture, was a monumental shift that happened over thousands of years, independently in the Americas. We'll explore these later. For now, let's reflect on these very first human inhabitants of America, walking across a land that no longer exists, carrying with them the nascent seeds of culture, resilience, and ingenuity that would define human history on this continent for millennia to come. Their journey, largely unwritten, laid the invisible groundwork for everything that followed. They were the true pioneers. Moving forward from the nomadic hunter-gatherers, our attention now turns to the development of complex, settled societies across North America, long before any Europeans set foot on these shores. These were not primitive tribes, but sophisticated civilizations, with intricate social structures, advanced agricultural practices, and monumental architecture. We will focus on two prominent examples: the Mississippian cultures of the eastern woodlands and the ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest. First, let us travel to the heartland of North America, specifically to a region near modern-day St. Louis, Missouri. Here flourished Cahokia, the largest and most influential urban center of the Mississippian culture. At its peak around 1050 to 1200 CE, Cahokia was larger than London was at the same time, with a population estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 people, and potentially another 30,000 to 50,000 in surrounding settlements. Imagine a bustling metropolis of its era, not with stone buildings, but with earthen mounds, vast plazas, and organized living spaces. The defining feature of Cahokia, and indeed the Mississippian culture, was the construction of enormous earthen mounds. These were not mere burial sites, though some served that purpose. Many were flat-topped platforms, serving as foundations for important buildings, temples, residences for elite leaders, or ceremonial structures. The largest of these, Monk's Mound, is a colossal structure, standing over 100 feet tall and covering 14 acres at its base. It's larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza in volume. Consider the sheer human effort required to construct such a monument using only baskets of earth, a testament to a highly organized society with a centralized authority capable of mobilizing thousands of laborers. Cahokia was a vibrant, hierarchical society. At its apex would have been powerful chiefs or paramount leaders, likely with religious authority, living atop the largest mounds. Beneath them were various social strata: priests, skilled artisans, warriors, and a large population of commoners who cultivated the fields and contributed labor. Their economy was primarily based on maize corn agriculture, which allowed for a settled, surplus-producing lifestyle. The fertile floodplains of the Mississippi River provided ideal conditions for cultivating corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters of Native American agriculture. Trade was also vital. Cahokia sat at a pivotal location, serving as a hub for a vast trade network extending across the continent. Goods like copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, and mica from the Appalachian Mountains have been found at Cahokia, indicating extensive long-distance exchange. This wasn't just about goods, it facilitated the exchange of ideas, technologies, and religious practices, influencing other Mississippian settlements. Their artistic expressions, particularly in shell carvings and ceramics, reflect a rich cosmological belief system, often depicting bird-men, serpents, and other symbolic figures. The eventual decline of Cahokia, around 1300 CE, is still debated by archaeologists. Theories include environmental degradation, deforestation, overuse of resources, climate change affecting agriculture, internal social unrest, or even disease. What is clear is that the grand city eventually dispersed, leaving behind its monumental mounds as silent witnesses to a once thriving civilization. Now, let's shift our gaze thousands of miles west, to the arid landscapes of the American Southwest. Here, for over 1,000 years, flourished the ancestral Puebloans, often referred to by the Navajo term, Anasazi, which means, ancient enemies, or, ancestors of our enemies. Their story is one of remarkable adaptation to a harsh, beautiful environment, primarily through innovative architectural and agricultural practices. The ancestral Puebloans are renowned for their distinctive dwellings. Initially, they lived in pit houses, semi-subterranean structures. But over centuries, they evolved their architecture, culminating in the iconic cliff dwellings and multi-story pueblos built into canyon walls or on mesa tops. Sites like Mesa Verde in Colorado, Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, and Canyon de Chelly in Arizona showcase their engineering prowess. Imagine entire communities nestled into alcoves of sheer sandstone cliffs, protected from the elements and defensible. These structures were not just shelters, they were integrated communities. The multi-story pueblos, built from stone and adobe, often contained hundreds of rooms, with communal plazas and circular, subterranean ceremonial structures called kivas. Kivas were central to their spiritual life, used for rituals, meetings, and storytelling. The sophisticated construction techniques, requiring careful quarrying of stone and precise masonry, are astonishing given the tools available. Like the Mississippians, agriculture was the bedrock of Puebloan society, but adapted to a desert environment. They developed ingenious irrigation systems, including dams, canals, and terraced fields, to capture and manage precious rainfall. Their primary crops were also corn, beans, and squash, cultivated with dry farming techniques where water was scarce. The resilience of their agricultural methods allowed them to support relatively large, settled populations in a challenging environment. Chaco Canyon, in particular, represents a zenith of ancestral Puebloan achievement, especially between 850 and 1250 CE. It was a major regional center, featuring massive, great houses, connected by an extensive network of straight roads, some extending for miles across the landscape. These roads, seemingly impractical for mere travel, are believed to have held ceremonial or symbolic significance, perhaps connecting various ritual sites. The purpose of Chaco Canyon itself, whether a capital, a pilgrimage site, or a vast trading center, is still debated, but its astronomical alignments within the architecture point to a deep understanding of the cosmos. Like Cahokia, the ancestral Puebloans also experienced periods of decline and dispersal, particularly during the late 13th century. A prolonged megadrought across the southwest is a leading theory, forcing communities to abandon their large settlements and migrate to areas with more reliable water sources. This led to the formation of the modern Pueblo peoples, who continue to live in the southwest today, maintaining many of their ancient traditions. In comparing these two sophisticated civilizations, we see different paths to complexity. The Mississippians, leveraging riverine environments for agriculture and trade, built vast earthwork cities and hierarchical societies. The ancestral Puebloans, adapting to aridity, mastered stone architecture and water management in a visually dramatic fashion. Both demonstrate that North America was home to thriving, diverse, and advanced societies long before Europeans arrived, societies that shaped the landscape, developed unique cultures, and left behind an indelible legacy in the form of their monumental achievements. These were not new worlds for the Europeans, but ancient lands already rich with human history. While Christopher Columbus is often credited with discovering America, the true first Europeans to set foot on North American soil were the Norse, or Vikings, nearly 500 years earlier. Their voyages across the North Atlantic represent an incredible feat of seamanship and exploration, though their attempts at colonization were ultimately short-lived. This chapter will delve into the sagas, the archaeological evidence, and the realities of these daring journeys to what they called Vinland. Our story begins in Scandinavia, around the late 10th and early 11th centuries. The Norse were renowned for their longships, their navigational skills, and their expansionist spirit. They had already colonized Iceland in the late 9th century, and from there, Eric the Red sailed west and established settlements in Greenland around 985 CE. Greenland, though named enticingly, was a harsh, icy frontier, pushing the limits of their agricultural and pastoral capabilities. It was from Greenland that the next westward leap occurred. According to two primary Norse sagas, the Greenland Saga and Eric the Red Saga, a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was blown off course during a voyage from Iceland to Greenland around 986 CE. He sighted new, forested lands to the west, but, remarkably, did not land. He simply reported his sightings upon returning to Greenland. This tale, whether entirely accurate or embellished, ignited curiosity. The true explorer, according to the sagas, was Leif Erikson, Eric the Red's son. Around 1000 CE, inspired by Bjarni's account, Leif set sail with a crew, specifically to explore these new lands. The sagas describe three distinct regions they encountered. Helluland, flat stone land believed to be Baffin Island, characterized by barren, rocky landscapes. Markland, forest land, likely Labrador, noted for its abundant timber, a valuable resource scarce in Greenland. Vinland, wine land or pasture land, the most appealing, with forests, salmon-filled rivers, and wild grapes or berries that resembled them, prompting the name. This is generally accepted to be the northern tip of Newfoundland. Imagine Leif Erikson and his crew, a small group of perhaps 30 to 40 individuals, navigating the treacherous North Atlantic in their open longships. These were incredibly sturdy vessels, designed for both ocean voyages and shallow water exploration. Navigation relied on celestial bodies, prevailing winds, and rudimentary knowledge of coastlines. The sheer courage and resilience required for such a voyage, without modern charts or communication, is astounding. They were truly venturing into the unknown. For centuries, the Vinland sagas were dismissed as myths or legends. That changed dramatically in the 1960s with the archaeological discoveries at Lance aux Meadows, pronounced Lands aux Meadows, on the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, Canada. Norwegian archaeologists Helga and Anne Stein Ingstad unearthed the undeniable remains of a Norse settlement. The evidence was compelling. Turf longhouses, a forge for ironworking, a technology unknown to indigenous peoples there at the time, boat repair facilities, and artifacts like a bronze pin, a spindle whorl indicating spinning and weaving, and iron rivets consistent with Norse shipbuilding. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the site's occupation to around 1000 CE, perfectly aligning with the saga accounts of Leif Erikson. This discovery provided irrefutable proof that Europeans had indeed reached North America centuries before Columbus. Lance aux Meadows appears to have been a temporary base, likely a winter camp or a series of exploratory outposts, rather than a long-term colony. The sagas describe a more extended stay in Vinland by Leif's brother, Thorvald, and later, an attempt at more significant colonization by Thorfinn Karlsefni, who brought women and livestock. However, these attempts at permanent settlement faced formidable challenges. Distance and supply lines. Vinland was thousands of miles from the Norse heartland, making resupply and reinforcement incredibly difficult. Greenland itself was a marginal colony. Harsh environment. While Vinland was more hospitable than Greenland, it was still a frontier with harsh winters and unknown challenges. Indigenous peoples. The Norse encountered indigenous inhabitants, whom they called Skrælings. The sagas describe both peaceful encounters and violent conflicts. These indigenous groups were well established and numerous, making sustained Norse encroachment difficult. The superior weaponry of the Norse iron tools and weapons initially gave them an advantage, but they were vastly outnumbered. Imagine the culture shock for both sides upon meeting. Limited resources and manpower. The Norse did not have the vast resources or population base of the later European powers to support large-scale colonization. Their primary motivation was likely timber, furs, and perhaps new fishing grounds. Ultimately, after a few years, perhaps a decade or two of intermittent attempts, the Norse abandoned their Vinland enterprise. The reasons were a combination of hostile encounters with indigenous peoples, the difficulty of maintaining a long supply line, and perhaps the sheer effort required to establish a viable colony in such a remote and challenging environment. The Norse sagas provide vivid, if sometimes legendary, accounts of these interactions, tales of battles, skirmishes, and uneasy truces. The Norse legacy in North America, while historically significant as the first European contact, remained largely unknown to the rest of Europe. Their voyages did not lead to sustained colonization, widespread trade, or a lasting cultural impact on the indigenous peoples. The discovery remained a fleeting echo, a historical footnote until the Lance aux Meadows discovery brought it back into the light. It serves as a reminder that history is often far more complex, and far older, than our conventional narratives suggest. Their ships, battling the fierce North Atlantic, carried with them the very first European dreams of a land to the west, dreams that would lie dormant for centuries before being reawakened with a different intent and a different outcome. Our journey through the early history of America now brings us to a pivotal figure, Christopher Columbus, and the series of voyages that irrevocably link the Old World with the New. While the Norse may have briefly touched these shores centuries earlier, it was Columbus's enterprise that initiated the sustained era of European exploration, conquest, and colonization. To understand his achievement, we must first understand the world of navigation, science, and ambition he inhabited in the late 15th century. Columbus was not unique in believing the Earth was round. Educated Europeans of his era had known the Earth was spherical for centuries, dating back to ancient Greek scholars. The real debate, and Columbus's critical miscalculation, was about the size of the Earth's circumference and, consequently, the distance from Europe to Asia by sailing west. The prevailing scholarly estimate of the Earth's circumference, based on the work of ancient Greek geographers like Eratosthenes, was remarkably accurate. However, Columbus cherry-picked his sources, relying heavily on the smaller estimates provided by Ptolemy and particularly by an Arab astronomer named al-Farghani, whose measurements he interpreted incorrectly and converted into an even smaller figure. He also significantly overestimated the eastward extension of Asia, believing Japan, Cipangu, was much closer to Europe than it actually was. Therefore, Columbus believed that Asia was only about 2,400 nautical miles west of the Canary Islands. The actual distance to Japan is closer to 10,600 nautical miles, and to the Caribbean, about 3,000 nautical miles. This massive miscalculation was, ironically, crucial to his success. Had he known the true distance, he likely would never have embarked, as sustaining a voyage of that length with 15th-century technology would have been impossible. He would have run out of provisions, water, and crew morale long before reaching his destination. So, how did one navigate in the late 15th century? It was a combination of art and science, often relying on rudimentary tools and immense skill. Dead reckoning. This was the primary method. Sailors would estimate their position based on their course direction, often determined by a magnetic compass, and speed estimated by timing a floating object or using a ship log. They would continuously plot their progress on a chart. This method was prone to error due to currents, winds, and inaccurate speed estimations. Celestial navigation, latitude. Navigators could determine their latitude, north-south position, by measuring the angle of the North Star, Polaris, above the horizon in the northern hemisphere, or the sun at its zenith in the southern hemisphere, using instruments like the quadrant or astrolabe. This was fairly reliable for latitude. Longitude. This was the intractable problem of the era. There was no accurate way to determine longitude, east-west position, at sea until the development of chronometers in the 18th century. This meant navigators truly didn't know how far east or west they had traveled with precision. Columbus famously kept two logbooks, one accurate for himself, and one falsified with shorter distances to reassure his crew. The ships themselves were marvels of their time. For his first voyage in 1492, Columbus commanded 3 ships: the larger Santa Maria, a carrack, a larger cargo ship, and 2 smaller, faster caravels, the Nina and the Pinta. Caravels were designed for maneuverability and shallow water exploration, with lateen triangular sails that allowed them to sail closer to the wind. These ships were relatively small by modern standards, perhaps 60 to 80 feet long, and carried crews of about 25 to 40 men. Life aboard these vessels was arduous. Crews lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions. Food consisted of salted meat, hardtack biscuits, dried fish, and fermented wine or stale water. Fresh provisions ran out quickly. Disease was a constant threat, particularly scurvy due to vitamin C deficiency, which would devastate crews on longer voyages. Morale was a persistent challenge, especially as weeks turned into months with no sight of land. Imagine the fear and superstition among sailors who had never ventured so far into the unknown. Columbus spent years seeking patronage for his westward voyage. He was rejected by Portugal, whose focus was on the established route around Africa. Finally, after 7 years of lobbying, he secured funding from the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, fresh from their victory over the Moors at Granada. They were motivated by a desire for new trade routes to the east, the promise of gold, and the spread of Christianity. The agreement, the capitulations of Santa Fe, granted Columbus significant titles and a percentage of any riches found. On August 3, 1492, the 3 ships departed Palos de la Frontera, Spain. After a stop in the Canary Islands for repairs and resupply, they set sail into the vast, unknown Atlantic on September 6. For weeks, the ships sailed west, following the trade winds. The crew grew increasingly anxious, even mutinous, as days turned into weeks with no land in sight. Columbus's ability to maintain discipline and quell unrest, sometimes by fudging the logbook to show shorter distances, was crucial. Finally, at 2 a.m. on October 12, 1492, a lookout on the Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana, sighted land. It was a small island in the Bahamas, which Columbus named San Salvador, likely modern-day Samana Cay or Watlings Island. He believed he had reached the East Indies, and thus, called the indigenous people he encountered, Indians. His initial encounters with the Taino people were peaceful, marked by an exchange of goods. Columbus noted their gentle nature and, crucially, their gold ornaments, which immediately fueled his primary motivation for future voyages, the acquisition of riches. He spent weeks exploring the Caribbean, discovering Cuba, which he believed was mainland China, and Hispaniola, where he established a small settlement, La Navidad, before returning to Spain. Columbus's first voyage was not just a navigational triumph, it was a watershed moment in human history. It connected two vastly separate worlds, initiating a cascade of events that would transform global economies, demographics, and cultures. While his calculations were flawed, his ambition and perseverance were undeniable. He set in motion a period of intense European exploration and expansion, forever changing the course of history for both the Old World and the New. The ocean, once a terrifying barrier, had become a pathway. The moment Christopher Columbus's ships touched the shores of the Americas in 1492 initiated an exchange so profound and far-reaching that it fundamentally reshaped the biology, ecology, demography, and cultures of the entire planet. This phenomenon, termed the Columbian Exchange by historian Alfred W. Crosby, was a two-way street of unparalleled consequence, a grand, involuntary experiment in global homogenization and diversification. It's not just about goods, it's about the very fabric of life. Let's first consider the most devastating, yet often overlooked, aspect of this exchange: diseases. European explorers and settlers inadvertently carried a battery of highly contagious diseases to which the indigenous populations of the Americas had no prior exposure and thus no acquired immunity. These diseases included smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, bubonic plague, cholera, and malaria. The impact was catastrophic. Within decades, indigenous populations plummeted by 50% to 90% in many regions, creating demographic collapses on a scale unprecedented in human history. Entire societies were decimated. Smallpox, in particular, was a horrifying killer, leaving survivors disfigured and often blind. Imagine a disease ripping through a community where no one has ever encountered it before. There's no inherited resistance, no prior exposure to build immunity, no traditional remedies that work. This wasn't just a side effect of colonization, it often preceded direct contact with Europeans, weakening societies and making them more susceptible to conquest. The sheer scale of this demographic catastrophe is difficult to grasp, but it fundamentally altered the human landscape of the Americas, creating vast empty lands that European settlers would later fill. However, the exchange wasn't entirely one-sided in terms of disease. While less impactful on European populations, certain diseases did travel from the Americas to Europe. The most prominent example is syphilis, which rapidly spread across Europe following Columbus's return. While theories vary on its precise origin, evidence strongly suggests a New World origin for the virulent strains that emerged in the late 15th century. Now, let's turn to the other crucial elements of the exchange: crops and animals. This is where the positive impacts, in terms of global food security and dietary diversity, become apparent, albeit with long-term ecological consequences. From the Americas to the Old World came a truly revolutionary suite of staple crops that would transform global agriculture and diets. Potatoes. Perhaps the single most impactful crop. Easily grown in diverse climates, high in calories and nutrients, potatoes became a dietary staple across Europe, particularly in Ireland, Germany, and Russia, leading to significant population growth. Imagine a world without the potato. Maize, corn, another incredibly versatile and high-yield crop. Maize spread rapidly across Africa, Europe, and Asia, becoming a fundamental food source for both humans and livestock, fueling agricultural revolutions. Tomatoes. Initially viewed with suspicion in Europe, sometimes thought to be poisonous, tomatoes eventually became central to Mediterranean cuisine, unimaginable without them today. Chili peppers. Introduced a new level of spice and flavor to global cuisines, revolutionizing dishes from India to Thailand. Cacao, chocolate, the bean from which chocolate is made, originally a bitter, ceremonial drink in Mesoamerica, transformed into a beloved sweet treat. Tobacco. Perhaps the most economically significant, if ultimately detrimental to health. Tobacco rapidly became a major cash crop, particularly in the southern English colonies, driving labor demands and the transatlantic slave trade. Beans, peanuts, avocados, pineapples, vanilla, sweet potatoes, turkeys, a whole host of other foods and animals that diversified global diets and economies. These American crops, requiring less labor and offering higher yields than many Old World equivalents, led to population booms in Europe, Africa, and Asia, indirectly contributing to the very pressures that fueled further colonization. In the other direction, from the Old World to the Americas, came a similar, though different, array of transformative elements. Livestock. European animals fundamentally altered the landscape and native cultures of the Americas. Horses, in particular, had a profound impact on Native American nomadic cultures, especially on the Great Plains, transforming hunting, warfare, and travel. Cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats provided new sources of protein, milk, wool, and labor. Pigs, being omnivorous and free-ranging, reproduced quickly and often went feral, devastating native plant and animal populations. Crops. While American crops were arguably more revolutionary globally, European crops like wheat, rice, barley, and oats were crucial for European settlers to replicate their familiar agricultural practices in the New World. Sugar cane, originally from Asia, became a hugely profitable cash crop in the Caribbean and Brazil, driving the demand for African slave labor. Coffee and bananas also became key crops in the Americas, though not originating in Europe. Weeds. Less glamorous but ecologically significant, European weeds like dandelions and plantain seeds arrived inadvertently in ship ballast and animal dung, outcompeting native flora in disturbed areas. The Columbian Exchange led to a massive reshuffling of the world's biota. Landscapes were transformed, forests were cleared for farms, new animal species grazed and rooted, and introduced plants-altered ecosystems. This was not a controlled experiment, it was a chaotic, often brutal, process driven by human ambition, economic imperatives, and biological forces. The exchange also accelerated the transatlantic slave trade. The decimation of indigenous populations by disease, coupled with the European demand for labor to cultivate lucrative cash crops like sugar and tobacco in the Americas, led to the forced migration of millions of Africans across the Atlantic. This new labor system, rooted in racialized chattel slavery, would define the economic and social structures of many American colonies for centuries. In essence, the Columbian Exchange created a new, interconnected global system. It spurred global trade, shifted population centers, changed dietary habits, and brought about both unprecedented prosperity for some and unimaginable suffering for others. It laid the biological and ecological foundation for the modern world, a world where foods and animals we take for granted are in fact products of this vast, 5-century-old global reshuffling. The ripples of 1492 continue to influence our planet today. Following Columbus's initial voyages, Spain quickly emerged as the dominant European power in the Americas, establishing a vast colonial empire that stretched from Tierra del Fuego in the south to what is now the American Southwest. This era was defined by the conquistadors, a blend of soldier, explorer, and fortune seeker, driven by a powerful combination of God, gold, and glory. Their methods were often brutal, their impact profound, and their legacy deeply imprinted on the cultural landscape of Latin America and parts of the United States. The initial phase of Spanish conquest focused on the Caribbean islands. Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti and Dominican Republic, became the first base, quickly followed by Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. Here, the Spanish established their first settlements, introduced European diseases that decimated the indigenous Taino populations, and began experimenting with systems of forced labor, primarily the encomienda system. Under this system, Spanish colonists were granted control over specific indigenous communities, ostensibly to protect and Christianize them, but in practice, it was a system of forced labor and tribute, little different from slavery. From the Caribbean, the Spanish gaze turned to the mainland, fueled by rumors of vast native empires and unimaginable riches. The most famous, and infamous, of these conquests were those of the Aztec Empire by Hernán Cortés in Mexico, 1519–1521, and the Inca Empire by Francisco Pizarro in Peru, 1532. These conquests, involving relatively small numbers of Spanish soldiers overcoming vastly superior indigenous forces, were facilitated by a combination of European weaponry, steel, gunpowder, the use of horses terrifying to indigenous peoples who had never seen them, superior military tactics, internal divisions within the native empires, and, most crucially, the devastating impact of European diseases. The immense wealth extracted from these conquests, particularly silver from mines like Potosi in Peru, flooded into Spain, transforming its economy and making it the most powerful nation in Europe for over a century. This wealth, however, also fueled inflation and ultimately contributed to Spain's long-term economic decline. Beyond the major empires, Spanish exploration pushed northward into what would become the United States. Juan Ponce de León was one of the earliest, exploring and naming Florida in 1513, searching for the fabled Fountain of Youth. His attempts to establish a colony there were met with fierce resistance from indigenous groups. Hernando de Soto led a massive expedition through the southeastern United States from 1539 to 1542, ranging through Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. His expedition was characterized by brutality, the introduction of diseases that devastated the Mississippian cultures we discussed earlier, and a relentless but ultimately fruitless search for gold. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado embarked on an equally ambitious journey from 1540 to 1542, exploring the American Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas in search of the legendary Seven Cities of Cibola. While he found no golden cities, his expedition provided the first detailed European descriptions of the Pueblo peoples and the vast plains, inadvertently introducing horses to the region, which would later transform Plains Indian culture. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Spanish shifted from pure conquest to establishing more permanent settlements and institutions. The cornerstone of Spanish colonization was the mission system and the Presidio fort. Missions. Established by Franciscan and Jesuit friars, missions served multiple purposes: to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity, to teach them European agricultural methods and crafts, and to pacify them for Spanish rule. They were often self-sufficient agricultural communities, but they also imposed strict discipline and often eroded indigenous cultures and languages. Examples include the chain of missions in California, Texas, and New Mexico. Presidios. These military forts were built to protect the missions and Spanish settlements from hostile indigenous groups or other European powers. They served as administrative centers and outposts of Spanish authority. Pueblos, towns, Spanish towns were laid out according to strict grid patterns, centered around a main plaza, with government buildings and churches facing it. These towns served as centers of administration, trade, and culture. Street. Augustine, Florida, founded in 1565, is the oldest continuously inhabited European established settlement in the United States, a testament to Spanish longevity. Santa Fe, New Mexico, founded in 1610, is another early example. The Spanish colonial administration was highly centralized and bureaucratic, governed directly from Spain through a Council of the Indies. Power flowed from the king to viceroys, royal governors, in the Americas. This centralized control, while efficient for extracting resources, often stifled local initiative and led to resentment among the mixed-race populations that emerged. The social structure of Spanish America was also rigidly hierarchical, based on a caste system, sistema de castas, that privileged those of pure Spanish blood born in Spain, peninsulares, followed by Spaniards born in the Americas. Criollos, then various mixed-race groups, mestizos, mulattoes, and finally indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans at the bottom. This system created deep social divisions that would persist for centuries. The long-term impact of Spanish colonization on what is now the United States is profound. Spanish language, culture, architecture, and religious traditions are still visible in the Southwest and Florida. The introduction of horses, cattle, and new agricultural techniques transformed the landscape and the lives of Native Americans. However, it also came at a terrible cost: the decimation of indigenous populations, the imposition of forced labor, and the suppression of native cultures. Spain laid the first major European claim to vast swaths of the Americas, establishing a pattern of empire building that would soon be replicated, and challenged, by other European powers. While Spain focused on gold and large-scale agricultural exploitation in the south, another European power, France, carved out a distinct and sprawling empire in North America, largely driven by the lucrative fur trade and a different approach to indigenous relations. From the vast, frozen landscapes of modern-day Canada down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico, France's presence, known as New France, was characterized by exploration, trade, and a strategic network of forts and trading posts. French involvement in North America began tentatively in the early 16th century with fishermen off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland and explorers like Jacques Cartier, who in the 1530s explored the St. Lawrence River, hoping to find a northwest passage to Asia. He reached the sites of future Quebec and Montreal, encountering indigenous communities, but no permanent settlements were established at this early stage. The real impetus for French colonization came in the early 17th century, driven by the insatiable European demand for beaver pelts. Beaver fur was highly prized for making felt hats, a fashionable accessory across Europe. This economic incentive shaped the entire character of New France. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain established a permanent trading post at Quebec, strategically located on a high bluff overlooking the St. Lawrence River. Champlain, known as the father of New France, was not just a colonizer but also a meticulous cartographer and ethnographer. He understood that success in this vast wilderness depended on building relationships with Native American tribes. Unlike the Spanish, who often sought to conquer and assimilate indigenous populations, the French primarily sought to ally with them for economic benefit. They needed Native American knowledge of the land, their hunting skills, and their network of trade routes. This led to a unique pattern of interaction. Alliances. The French forged strong alliances with tribes like the Huron and the Algonquin, often supporting them in conflicts against their traditional enemies, particularly the Iroquois Confederacy. This mutual dependence, though beneficial, also drew Native Americans into European conflicts. Coureurs des bois, runners of the woods, these were adventurous French fur traders who ventured deep into the interior, living among Native American tribes, learning their languages, adopting some of their customs, and often intermarrying. They were the backbone of the fur trade, establishing vast networks and French influence far beyond official settlements. Imagine these hardy individuals, paddling canoes through vast river systems, enduring harsh winters, and negotiating with diverse tribal groups. Missionaries. Jesuit missionaries, known as Black Robes, to many Native Americans, also played a significant role, venturing into the interior to convert indigenous peoples. While some conversions occurred, their primary impact was often in documenting Native American languages and cultures, providing invaluable historical records. The vast geography of New France reflected this focus on trade and exploration. Instead of compact agricultural settlements, the French established a network of strategically located forts and trading posts along major rivers and lakes. Quebec and Montreal on the St. Lawrence, serving as the primary urban centers and collection points for furs. Forts along the Great Lakes, e.g., Fort Niagara, Fort Detroit, to control access to interior fur grounds. And most significantly, French explorers like Louis Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette in the 1670s, and later René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle in the 1680s, explored the entire length of the Mississippi River. La Salle claimed the entire Mississippi River basin for France, naming it Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. This was an audacious claim, encompassing a vast territory from the Appalachian Mountains to the Rockies, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The establishment of posts like New Orleans, founded 1718, at the mouth of the Mississippi, and Fort de Chartres in Illinois solidified French control over this immense waterway, giving them a strategic advantage in North America. This vast, thinly populated territory, however, was fundamentally different from the densely settled English colonies to the east. The French colonial system was more centrally controlled than the English, with a governor and an intendant responsible for justice, finance, and policing appointed by the king. Seigneurial system, a form of feudal land tenure, was implemented in some areas to encourage settlement, but the lure of the fur trade often pulled young men away from farming. Compared to the British colonies, New France had a much smaller European population. Its focus was less on large-scale agricultural settlement and more on resource extraction, furs, and strategic control of waterways. This led to fewer direct conflicts over land with Native Americans, at least initially, and fostered a relationship based on mutual economic interest and occasional military alliance against common enemies. However, this reliance on the fur trade made New France vulnerable. As European demand for furs fluctuated, and as beaver populations declined in accessible areas, the economy became less stable. Moreover, their expansive territory, combined with a relatively small population, made defense against the increasingly populous and expansionist British colonies a persistent challenge. The legacy of New France is visible today in the French language and culture of Quebec and Louisiana, in place names across the continent, and in the enduring historical memory of the vast fur trade networks. It represents a distinct European approach to North American colonization, one that prioritized alliance and trade over immediate conquest and mass settlement, setting the stage for future imperial conflicts that would redefine the map of the continent. Our focus shifts now to the nascent attempts of England to establish a foothold in North America, a story of ambition, hardship, and an enduring mystery that continues to captivate historians. Long before Jamestown, England made several attempts to plant a colony on Roanoke Island, off the coast of present-day North Carolina. These efforts culminated in the disappearance of an entire settlement, forever known as the Lost Colony. England, somewhat belatedly compared to Spain and Portugal, began to eye North America in the late 16th century. Driven by a desire for new wealth, a strategic outpost against Spain, and the elusive hope of finding the Northwest Passage, Queen Elizabeth I granted patents for exploration and colonization. A key figure in these early ventures was Sir Walter Raleigh, a dashing courtier and adventurer. Raleigh, unable to leave the Queen's side, dispatched expeditions in the 1580s. The first reconnaissance voyage in 1584 returned with glowing reports of a fertile land and friendly indigenous people. This optimistic outlook fueled the first attempt at colonization. The first Roanoke colony, 1585-1586, Raleigh sent a military expedition of about 100 men, led by Sir Richard Grenville and governed by Ralph Lane. They landed on Roanoke Island. The initial goal was to establish a base for privateering against Spanish ships and to explore for resources. Imagine these men, mostly soldiers, engineers, and scientists, ill-equipped for sustained settlement, facing a new environment. Life was incredibly difficult. The soil was not as fertile as expected, fresh water was scarce, and relations with the local Algonquin-speaking Native Americans, initially friendly, quickly deteriorated. The English, accustomed to their own ways, struggled to adapt. They relied heavily on the Native Americans for food, but their demands and occasional aggression, such as destroying a Native American village over a stolen silver cup, led to increasing hostility. Tensions escalated, culminating in the killing of a local chief, Wingina, by Lane's men. After less than a year, facing starvation and constant Native American hostility, the colonists seized an opportunity when Sir Francis Drake, returning from a raid on Spanish cities, stopped by Roanoke. They abandoned the colony and sailed back to England with Drake in 1586. Shortly after their departure, Grenville arrived with supplies and reinforcements, only to find the colony deserted. He left a small garrison of 15 men to maintain England's claim. The second Roanoke colony, the Lost Colony, 1587. Undeterred, Raleigh planned a more ambitious venture, a true civilian colony, including women and children, led by John White, an artist who had been part of the earlier expeditions. The goal was to establish a permanent agricultural settlement, hopefully on the Chesapeake Bay, further north. In July 1587, about 117 colonists arrived back at Roanoke Island, expecting to find Grenville's small garrison. They found only a skull and bones, suggesting the garrison had been massacred. Despite the ominous sign, their pilot refused to take them further north, forcing them to settle on Roanoke Island once more. The colonists immediately faced familiar problems: food shortages, inadequate supplies, and hostile Native Americans. John White's own daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth to the first English child born in the Americas, Virginia Dare, on August 18, 1587. This was a symbol of hope for a truly permanent settlement. However, the situation quickly became dire. To ensure the colony's survival, the colonists pleaded with John White to return to England for more supplies and reinforcements. Reluctantly, White agreed, leaving his daughter, granddaughter, and the entire colony behind. White arrived back in England in late 1587, only to find the country preparing for the Spanish Armada, the formidable Spanish invasion fleet. All ships were pressed into service for England's defense, and a direct order from the Queen forbade any large vessels from leaving. White was stuck. It would be 3 long, agonizing years before he could return to Roanoke. The disappearance, 1590, when John White finally managed to return to Roanoke Island in August 1590, he found the settlement deserted. There was no sign of the colonists, no distress signals, no evidence of struggle or battle. The houses had been dismantled, and a fort that had been built was gone. The only clues left behind were 2 carvings, the word, Croatoan, carved into a fence post, and the letters, Crow, carved into a tree. White had arranged with the colonists that if they moved, they would carve their destination, and if they were in distress, they would carve a cross above the name. There was no cross. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, modern-day Hatteras Island, inhabited by a friendly Native American tribe. White believed the colonists had moved to Croatoan, perhaps integrating with the tribe for survival. However, a severe storm prevented his ships from sailing to Croatoan to investigate further, and he was forced to return to England, never to see his family or the colony again. The theories. The fate of the lost colony has remained one of America's oldest cold cases, generating numerous theories. Integration with Native Americans. This is the most widely accepted theory. Faced with starvation and hostile conditions, the colonists likely sought refuge and perhaps intermarried with the Croatoan or other friendly tribes, effectively assimilating into Native American society. Recent archaeological and DNA evidence has lent some support to this idea, suggesting possible genetic links between Roanoke descendants and some Native American communities. Massacre. Perhaps the most dramatic theory is that the colonists were massacred by hostile Native American tribes, possibly the Powhatan Confederacy, who viewed them as a threat. There are some historical accounts from later Jamestown settlers suggesting this, though concrete evidence is lacking. Environmental disaster. The possibility that disease, famine, or a combination of factors led to the slow demise of the colony, leaving no one to tell the tale. Spanish attack. While plausible, there's no historical record of a Spanish attack on the Roanoke colony at that time. The mystery of the lost colony had a chilling effect on subsequent English colonization efforts, serving as a cautionary tale of the immense difficulties of establishing a foothold in the New World. It underscored the challenges of logistics, supply, and particularly, relations with indigenous peoples. It would take more than another decade before England, with renewed determination, would try again, with Jamestown, a venture that would prove equally brutal, but ultimately, successful. The unyielding question of what happened to Virginia Dare and the other colonists remains a haunting whisper in the annals of American history. From the haunting silence of Roanoke, we turn to the desperate and brutal beginnings of England's first permanent settlement in North America, Jamestown, Virginia. Founded in 1607, this was not a triumphant venture, but a grueling fight for survival against disease, starvation, and constant conflict with a powerful Native American confederacy. Its early years were marked by such unimaginable hardship that it's a wonder it survived at all. The venture was spearheaded by the Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company. Unlike Raleigh's private ventures, this was a commercial enterprise, funded by investors hoping for quick profits from gold, timber, or other valuable commodities. On December 20, 1606, 3 ships, the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, departed England, carrying about 104 colonists. Upon arriving in Virginia in May 1607, the colonists made a critical and, ultimately, disastrous decision about their settlement location. They chose a site on a peninsula in the James River. While seemingly defensible against Spanish attack, it was a low-lying, marshy area with several severe disadvantages. Unhealthy environment. The brackish water of the James River, especially in summer, was contaminated with disease-carrying bacteria and was often undrinkable. The surrounding swamps were breeding grounds for mosquitoes, leading to rampant malaria and dysentery. Lack of fresh water. As the summer progressed, fresh water sources dwindled, forcing reliance on the polluted river. Lack of resources. The immediate area lacked abundant game, and the soil was not ideal for immediate agriculture. Hostile neighbors. The site was within the territory of the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, a formidable group of about 30 Algonquian-speaking tribes led by their paramount chief, Wahunsenaka, known as Powhatan. The colonists built a fort, but they were surrounded by a well-organized and numerous indigenous population. The initial group of colonists was ill-suited for the challenges of frontier survival. Many were gentlemen or their servants, with little experience in farming, carpentry, or manual labor. Their primary goal was to find gold, not to plant crops or build infrastructure. They spent valuable time digging for non-existent gold instead of preparing for the winter. The result was an almost immediate descent into misery. The first few years of Jamestown were characterized by incredibly high mortality rates. Within a year, more than half of the original colonists had died from disease, starvation, and skirmishes with Native Americans. The lowest point came during the winter of 1609-1610, a period horrifically known as the Starving Time. Relations with the Powhatan Confederacy had deteriorated into open warfare. The Powhatan Confederacy besieged the fort, preventing the colonists from foraging or hunting outside its walls. Trapped, isolated, and with no resupply ships arriving, the settlers ran out of food. The accounts from the starving time, or gruesome. Colonists resorted to eating their horses, dogs, cats, and rats. They consumed shoe leather, boiled boots, and roots. There are documented accounts, including archaeological evidence from Jamestown itself, of cannibalism, individuals resorting to eating the corpses of their fellow settlers to survive. Of the approximately 500 colonists present in the fall of 1609, only about 60 survived until spring 1610. Just as the last emaciated survivors were preparing to abandon Jamestown in June 1610, a new governor, Lord de la Warr, arrived with relief ships and fresh supplies, saving the colony from complete collapse. His arrival imposed much-needed order and discipline, but the fundamental problem remained: how to make Jamestown economically viable. The answer came not in gold, but in tobacco. In 1612, John Rolfe, one of the settlers, successfully cultivated a new, milder strain of tobacco in Virginia, using seeds he acquired from the Caribbean. This tobacco was far more palatable to European tastes than the harsh native Virginia variety. The demand for tobacco in England exploded, and Jamestown finally had a cash crop. Tobacco cultivation transformed Virginia. It was labor-intensive, requiring large tracts of land. This led to land expansion. Colonists pushed aggressively into Native American lands to grow more tobacco, leading to intensified conflict. Headright system. To attract more settlers and labor, the Virginia Company introduced the headright system in 1618. This granted 50 acres of land to any settler who paid for their own passage to Virginia, and another 50 acres for each person they brought with them. This spurred immigration, particularly of indentured servants. Demand for labor. The enormous profitability of tobacco created an insatiable demand for cheap labor. This demand initially led to a massive influx of indentured servants from England, individuals who agreed to work for a fixed period, typically 4 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to America. Introduction of slavery. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Virginia carrying 20 odd enslaved Africans. This moment is often considered the beginning of chattel slavery in English North America. While their initial legal status might have been ambiguous, perhaps indentured servitude, within a few decades, racialized chattel slavery became firmly entrenched as the primary labor system for the tobacco plantations of the southern colonies, fundamentally shaping American society and its future conflicts. Despite its horrific start, Jamestown eventually stabilized and grew, largely on the back of tobacco. It established the first representative assembly in English North America, the House of Burgesses, in 1619, laying the groundwork for self-governance. But its early years serve as a stark reminder of the brutal realities of early colonization, the immense cost in human lives, and the pivotal role of disease, indigenous relations, and the relentless search for economic viability in shaping the destiny of the future United States. The legacy of the starving time cast a long, dark shadow over the promise of the New World. From the commercial struggles of Jamestown, we journey north to a different kind of English settlement, driven not by the pursuit of gold or tobacco, but by the fervent desire for religious freedom, Plymouth Colony. Its founders, the Pilgrims, were a small band of religious separatists whose arduous journey and early struggles would become foundational to the American narrative, particularly the enduring myth of Thanksgiving. To understand the Pilgrims, we must first understand the religious ferment in England during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The Protestant Reformation had led to the establishment of the Church of England, or Anglican Church, with the monarch as its head. However, many felt this church had not gone far enough in reforming itself from Catholic practices. These individuals were broadly known as Puritans, as they wished to purify the Church of England from within. Within the larger Puritan movement, a smaller, more radical group emerged, the Separatists. Unlike most Puritans, the Separatists believed the Church of England was beyond reform and that true believers must separate themselves entirely from it to form their own pure congregations. This was a dangerous belief, as it challenged the authority of both the Church and the King, who was its head. Separatists faced persecution, imprisonment, and even execution. One such congregation of Separatists, from a small village in Nottinghamshire, fled England in 1608, seeking refuge in the more religiously tolerant Netherlands. They settled first in Amsterdam and then in Leiden. While they found religious freedom there, they worried about their children losing their English identity and being corrupted by the more liberal Dutch culture. They also struggled economically. Thus, they began to dream of a new life in America, where they could build a society based entirely on their religious principles, away from the corrupting influences of Europe. Securing a patent from the Virginia Company, and financing from a group of London merchants, they prepared for their voyage. In September 1620, about 102 passengers, a mix of these separatists, saints, about 40% of the total, and strangers, non-separatists, often indentured servants or craftsmen hired by the merchants, set sail from Plymouth, England, aboard the Mayflower. The voyage across the Atlantic was notoriously difficult. It was a small ship, crowded and uncomfortable. Storms buffeted the vessel, and many passengers suffered from seasickness and disease. Imagine being confined for 66 days in such conditions, with limited fresh water and stale food, the constant creaking of the ship, and the roar of the ocean. Their original destination was near the mouth of the Hudson River, within the territory of the Virginia Company. However, driven off course by storms, they sighted land far north of their patent, at Cape Cod, modern-day Massachusetts, in November 1620. This presented a problem. They were outside the jurisdiction of their patent, and some of the strangers among them began to grumble about the lack of established authority. To prevent dissension and ensure the survival of the group, the adult male passengers drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact before disembarking. This was a remarkable document, a simple agreement to create a civil body politic, and to enact just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. It was not a constitution in the modern sense, but it was a crucial step towards self-governance in America, demonstrating the principle of government by consent of the governed. The Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock on December 21, 1620, establishing Plymouth Colony. Their first winter, 1620-1621, was brutal. Lacking adequate shelter, facing harsh weather, and weakened by the long voyage and poor nutrition, nearly half of the colonists died from disease and starvation. This period, similar to Jamestown's starving time, tested their faith and resolve to the extreme. Survival was ultimately aided by the intervention of local Native Americans. In March 1621, Samoset, an Abenaki Sagamore, walked into their settlement, greeting them in English. He later introduced them to Tisquantum, better known as Squanto, a member of the Patuxet tribe, a subgroup of the Wampanoag Confederacy. Squanto had been captured by English explorers years earlier, taken to England, and had recently returned, learning English in the process. Squanto proved to be an invaluable intermediary. He taught the Pilgrims how to cultivate native corn, maize, using local methods, including fertilizing with fish, how to distinguish edible plants from poisonous ones, and where to find the best fishing spots. He also helped broker a crucial peace treaty between the Pilgrims and the powerful Wampanoag Confederacy, led by their chief, Massasoit. This alliance was vital for the colony's survival, providing mutual defense against other hostile tribes. In the autumn of 1621, after a successful harvest, the Pilgrims celebrated with a feast of Thanksgiving, joined by Massasoit and about 90 Wampanoag warriors. This event, now famously enshrined as the First Thanksgiving, symbolized a rare moment of cooperation and shared survival between European settlers and Native Americans, a fleeting period of peace before the inevitable conflicts over land. The Pilgrims, despite their small numbers, laid down key principles for future New England settlements: religious motivation for colonization, self-governance through covenant, and a strong community spirit. Their story, though often romanticized, highlights the incredible resilience required to establish a new society in the wilderness, driven by deeply held religious beliefs, and dependent, in crucial ways, on the generosity and knowledge of the indigenous inhabitants. Plymouth remained a separate colony until 1691, when it was absorbed into the much larger Massachusetts Bay Colony. Their legacy, however, extends far beyond their initial small settlement. While the Pilgrims of Plymouth sought to separate from the Church of England, a much larger and more influential group of religious reformers, the Puritans, had a different vision. They believed the Church of England could still be purified, and they sought to establish a model Christian society in the New World, a city upon a hill, that would inspire reform back home. This ambition led to the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, a venture that profoundly shaped the social, political, and religious landscape of New England. And, ultimately, America. The Puritans were a diverse group, but they shared core beliefs. Covenant theology. They believed in a covenant with God, where God made promises to them, and they, in turn, promised to live according to His laws. This concept extended to their civil society, which they saw as a civil covenant to create a righteous community. Predestination. While not universally accepted in its most extreme form, the idea that God had already chosen who would be saved influenced their lives, leading them to constantly seek signs of God's grace and to live devoutly. Importance of Scripture. The Bible was the ultimate authority, and literacy was highly valued so that everyone could read and interpret God's Word. Emphasis on community and discipline. They believed in a tightly knit community where moral and social order were paramount. Deviance was not tolerated lightly. Facing increasing persecution under King Charles I and Archbishop William Laud, who sought to suppress Puritan practices within the Church of England, many Puritans began to consider emigration. The Massachusetts Bay Company, initially formed for economic purposes, was shrewdly taken over by Puritan leaders, who obtained a royal charter in 1629. Crucially, they arranged for the company's charter to be transferred to New England, meaning that the governing body of the company would reside in the colony itself, giving them an unprecedented degree of self-governance. In 1630, a fleet of 11 ships carrying about 700 Puritan colonists, led by their devout governor, John Winthrop, arrived in Massachusetts. Winthrop famously articulated their vision in his sermon, a model of Christian charity, delivered aboard the Arbella on the way to America, for we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. This phrase captured the profound sense of purpose and divine mission that animated the Puritan experiment. They intended to create a shining example of a truly reformed society for the rest of the world. Unlike the rough-and-tumble adventurers of Jamestown, many of the Massachusetts Bay colonists were well-educated, skilled, and brought families with them. They settled in and around present-day Boston, quickly establishing towns like Salem, Dorchester, and Watertown. The social and political structure of Massachusetts Bay was unique. Congregationalism. Each Puritan congregation was largely self-governing. They chose their own ministers and set their own rules. Town meetings. The cornerstone of New England democracy. Adult male church members, freemen, participated directly in local governance, electing town officials, setting taxes, and deciding on local matters. This fostered a strong tradition of local self-rule. Limited suffrage. While revolutionary for its time, the franchise was limited. To be a full participant in the political life of the colony, to vote or hold office, one had to be a male church member in good standing. This blurred the lines between religious and civic authority and gave immense power to the clergy. Education. Puritans placed a high value on education, not just for religious literacy but also for civic participation. They established grammar schools and, notably, Harvard College in 1636, to train ministers and maintain an educated leadership. Life in Puritan Massachusetts was highly structured and centered around the church and community. Morality was strictly enforced through blue laws that regulated everything from public behavior to Sabbath observance. There was little tolerance for religious dissent, as the Puritans believed they were building God's chosen society, and dissent threatened its purity and divine favor. This lack of tolerance led to the banishment of several prominent individuals who challenged the Puritan orthodoxy. Roger Williams, a charismatic minister who advocated for religious freedom, separation of church and state, and fair dealings with Native Americans. He argued that the colonists had no right to the land without justly purchasing it. Banished in 1636, he went on to found Rhode Island, which became a haven for religious dissenters and a truly unique experiment in religious liberty. Anne Hutchinson, a spiritual leader who challenged the authority of the male clergy, arguing that salvation came through grace alone, not through good works or strict adherence to rules. She held religious meetings in her home, attracting a large following, including prominent citizens. Her independent interpretations were seen as a threat to both religious and social order. She was put on trial, banished in 1637, and eventually moved to Rhode Island. These banishments, while harsh, inadvertently contributed to the growth of other New England colonies like Rhode Island and Connecticut, which were founded by those seeking more freedom from Puritan control. The Puritans also engaged in complex, and often violent, relations with Native Americans. While some early interactions involved trade, the relentless expansion of Puritan settlements into Native American lands, fueled by their growing population and agricultural needs, inevitably led to conflict. The Pequot War of 1637, a brutal conflict resulting in the near annihilation of the Pequot tribe, marked a turning point in English-Native American relations in New England, signaling a shift towards aggressive land acquisition and displacement. Despite its rigidities and internal conflicts, the Massachusetts Bay Colony flourished. Its population grew rapidly, driven by both immigration and a healthier environment than the Chesapeake. Its emphasis on self-governance, community, and education laid crucial groundwork for the future American Republic, even as its initial vision of a religiously uniform city upon a hill gradually gave way to greater diversity and dissent. The legacy of Puritan ideals, hard work, civic engagement, and a sense of moral purpose would continue to shape American culture for centuries. Having explored the founding narratives and distinct characteristics of the early English colonies, let's now peel back the layers of grand historical events and delve into the mundane, yet fascinating, realities of daily life for ordinary colonists in 17th century America. This was a world vastly different from our own, shaped by hard labor, limited technology, omnipresent disease, and a constant struggle for survival. While there were regional variations, certain common threads ran through the lives of most early settlers. Imagine waking up in a typical 17th century colonial home. For most, this would be a small, single-story house, perhaps 1 or 2 rooms, built of wood, log cabins or timber-framed houses with clapboard siding, or occasionally stone or brick, depending on the region and available materials. Glass windows were a luxury. Many homes had oiled paper or wooden shutters. Heat came from a large fireplace, which also served for cooking. There was no running water, no indoor plumbing, and certainly no electricity. Water was drawn from a well or spring, often a laborious task. The majority of colonists, whether in the chilly fields of New England, the tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake, or the developing farms of the middle colonies, were farmers. Agriculture was the bedrock of survival and economy. Days were dictated by the sun and seasons, from dawn to dusk. New England. Focus on diversified farming, corn, beans, squash, some livestock. Shorter growing seasons and rockier soil meant less surplus, but communities were more self-sufficient. Chesapeake, Virginia and Maryland dominated by tobacco monoculture. This cash crop was incredibly labor-intensive. Fields were constantly being cleared, planted, tended, harvested, and cured. This led to a relentless demand for labor, driving the influx of indentured servants and, increasingly, enslaved Africans. Middle colonies: Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, known as the breadbasket colonies, they produced large surpluses of wheat, barley, and oats, benefiting from fertile soil and a more temperate climate. Tools were rudimentary: hoes, axes, sickles, and simple plows pulled by oxen or horses. Everything was done by hand. Life was physically demanding, requiring immense strength and endurance. Food was basic but often plentiful if crops were good. Corn was a staple in all regions, eaten as porridge, bread, or roasted. Meat came from livestock: pigs, chickens, cattle, or wild game if one was skilled enough to hunt. Fish and seafood were crucial for coastal communities. Preservation methods were vital. Salting, smoking, drying, and pickling were common, as there was no refrigeration. Meals were typically cooked over an open hearth. Clothing was practical and durable, made from homespun linen or wool. Styles were simple, designed for warmth and utility rather than fashion. Clothes were hand-stitched, and often repaired until they disintegrated. Disease and mortality were ever-present threats. Life expectancy was significantly lower than today, especially in the Chesapeake where malaria and other diseases thrived. Infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high. Smallpox, influenza, dysentery, and other ailments could wipe out entire families or communities. Medical knowledge was limited, relying on herbal remedies, bleeding, and often ineffective, even harmful, practices. Women played a crucial, indispensable role in colonial society. Beyond childbearing, large families were common due to high mortality and agricultural labor needs. They were responsible for the vast majority of household production. Cooking, cleaning, making soap, spinning thread, weaving cloth, making and mending clothes, tending kitchen gardens, preserving food, and caring for the sick. They were literally the backbone of the household economy. Children began contributing to household and farm labor from a very young age. Play was often intertwined with work. Formal education varied. In New England, driven by Puritan emphasis on literacy for religious reasons, public schools were established, and many learned to read and write. In the southern colonies, education was more often provided by tutors for the wealthy or not at all for the poor and enslaved. Social interaction was centered around the family, church, and local community. Travel was difficult and slow, limited to walking, horseback, or rudimentary carts. News spread slowly, often by word of mouth or infrequent letters. Entertainment was simple: storytelling, singing, card games, community gatherings, and religious services. Alcohol consumption, particularly cider and beer, was common, as water was often unsafe. Religion permeated every aspect of life, particularly in New England. Church attendance was mandatory, and sermons could last for hours. The Bible was a primary text, shaping moral codes, laws, and daily conduct. In the southern colonies, while the Anglican Church was dominant, its influence was often less pervasive than Puritanism in the North. The legal system was based on English common law, often adapted to local colonial conditions. Punishments for crimes could be harsh, including public shaming, stocks, pillory, whipping, and execution. In summary, 17th-century colonial life was defined by ceaseless labor, deep reliance on natural resources, constant vulnerability to disease, and a close-knit, often religiously structured, community. It was a life where survival was never guaranteed, and comfort was a rare luxury. Yet, it was through this grinding, daily struggle that the foundations of new societies were laid, and the unique characteristics of the different American regions began to emerge, shaping the future of a continent. From the hardscrabble daily life of the early colonists, we now turn to a darker, more chilling chapter in 17th-century America, the phenomenon of witchcraft accusations, culminating in the infamous Salem witch trials of 1692–1693. This episode, far from being an isolated incident, was a dramatic manifestation of deeply held religious beliefs, societal anxieties, and the potent power of fear in a frontier society. Belief in witchcraft was widespread in Europe and its colonies during the early modern period. For centuries, the devil was seen as a tangible force, actively seeking to corrupt souls and cause harm. Witchcraft was considered a heinous crime, both against God and against man, punishable by death. England, like much of Europe, had a history of witch trials, though they were typically less brutal than those on the continent. In colonial New England, the Puritan worldview emphasized a constant struggle between good and evil. The wilderness was seen as a place of spiritual danger, where the devil lurked, often in league with Native Americans, tempting individuals to stray from the path of righteousness. Any misfortune, crop failure, illness, livestock death, difficult childbirth, could be attributed to divine punishment or, more terrifyingly, to the malevolent influence of witches. Before Salem, there had been other, smaller outbreaks of witchcraft accusations in New England, but none reached the scale or intensity of what was to come. The crucible for the Salem witch trials was Salem Village, now Danvers, Massachusetts, a small, religiously conservative, and economically struggling community bordering the more prosperous Salem town. There were simmering tensions within the village, disputes over land, accusations of greed, and rivalries between different families and factions. This social friction created a fertile ground for suspicion. The events began in January 1692. The minister's daughter, Betty Paris, and his niece, Abigail Williams, along with other young girls in the village, began exhibiting strange behaviors: fits, uncontrolled screaming, bizarre contortions, and speaking in tongues. Doctors, unable to find a medical explanation, suggested the girls were afflicted by witchcraft. Under pressure, the girls accused 3 women of bewitching them. Tituba, a West Indian slave in the Paris household, whose storytelling about voodoo and witchcraft may have influenced the girls. Sarah Good, a poor, homeless woman known for her pipe smoking and mumbling. Sarah Osborne, an elderly, sickly woman who had recently married her indentured servant. These initial accusations targeted marginalized members of society, making them easy targets for a community seeking scapegoats. What followed was a terrifying legal process. The accused were brought before local magistrates. The girls, afflicted, behavior in the courtroom, where they would fall into fits or claim to be tormented by the accused, was accepted as powerful evidence, known as spectral evidence, testimony about what specters or ghosts of the accused did to the victims. This type of evidence was highly problematic, as it was impossible to disprove. As the trials progressed, the accusations spread like wildfire. The afflicted girls, and eventually other adults, began to accuse more respectable members of the community, including prominent citizens, land owners, and even former ministers. This broadened the scope of the panic. People quickly learned that confessing to witchcraft, and naming others, often led to imprisonment rather than execution, while maintaining one's innocence often led to conviction and hanging. This created a perverse incentive system, further fueling the accusations. The trials were conducted by a special court of oyer and termine to hear and to determine. Despite the lack of concrete evidence and reliance on spectral testimony, convictions mounted. Between June and September 1692, 19 individuals were hanged on Gallows Hill as convicted witches. Giles Corey, an elderly man, refused to plead innocent or guilty. He was subjected to peine forte et dure, a form of torture where stones were progressively piled on his chest until he was crushed to death, in an attempt to force a plea. He died without speaking, thus preserving his property for his heirs. Several others died in prison. Over 150 people were accused and jailed in total. The tide began to turn in late 1692 and early 1693. Prominent ministers and rational thinkers, notably Increase Mather and his son Cotton Mather, who had initially supported the trials but grew wary, began to question the use of spectral evidence. Governor William Phips, whose own wife had been accused, dissolved the court of oyer and termine and replaced it with a superior court of judicature, which prohibited spectral evidence. This effectively ended the convictions. All remaining accused individuals were eventually pardoned or released. The Salem witch trials left a lasting scar on the conscience of Massachusetts. In later years, judges, jurors, and even some of the accusers publicly apologized for their roles. The families of the victims were compensated. The causes of the Salem witch trials are complex and debated, but key factors include religious fanaticism and fear of the devil, social and economic tensions within the village, poor versus wealthy, rural versus urban, gender roles and anxieties. The majority of the accused were women, often those who challenged social norms. Psychological factors. Mass hysteria, perhaps fueled by ergot poisoning from contaminated rye, though this theory is largely discredited, or simply the power of suggestion and group delusion among impressionable young girls. Native American conflicts. King William's War, 1689-1697, with French and Native American allies on the frontier created immense anxiety and fear, which may have contributed to a climate of suspicion. The Salem witch trials serve as a potent historical lesson about the dangers of unchecked religious fervor, the fragility of justice in times of panic, and the devastating consequences when fear and superstition triumph over reason. It marked a turning point in New England, contributing to a shift away from strict Puritan theocracy towards a more rational and enlightened approach to law and governance. The memory of the witches of Salem endures as a chilling reminder of the dark side of colonial anxieties. Having explored the strict, often rigid, religious landscape of early Puritan New England, we now turn to a powerful and transformative movement that swept through the American colonies in the mid-18th century, the Great Awakening. This was not a single, unified event, but a series of religious revivals that fundamentally reshaped American Protestantism, challenged established hierarchies, and had profound social and political consequences, subtly preparing the ground for future revolutionary ideas. By the early 18th century, religious fervor in many colonies, particularly New England, seemed to be waning. Church membership was declining, and many felt that the established churches had become too intellectual, formal, and complacent. There was a sense that people had lost the intense personal connection to God that characterized earlier generations of Puritans. Rationalism and Enlightenment ideas were gaining ground, leading to a perceived spiritual complacency. The Great Awakening was a reaction to this perceived decline, a fervent call for a return to passionate, experiential faith. It emphasized individual conversion, the direct emotional experience of God's grace, and a personal relationship with the divine, rather than relying solely on formal rituals or the authority of the clergy. Key figures, known as New Light preachers, crisscrossed the colonies, delivering powerful, emotional sermons that moved thousands. Jonathan Edwards, a brilliant Congregationalist minister from Northampton, Massachusetts, often considered the intellectual leader of the Awakening in America. His most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, 1741, used vivid imagery to describe the precariousness of humanity's position before an omnipotent God and called for immediate repentance. His preaching was less about theatricality and more about profound theological insights that moved listeners to tears. George Whitefield, a charismatic Anglican minister from England, Whitefield was arguably the most influential figure of the Great Awakening. He was an itinerant preacher, traveling extensively throughout the colonies and England from the late 1730s to the 1770s. Whitefield was a master orator, with a booming voice and dramatic delivery. He preached to enormous outdoor crowds, sometimes tens of thousands of people, transcending denominational boundaries. His emotional appeals, delivered with theatrical flair, stirred deep religious emotions and led to mass conversions. Imagine standing in an open field, listening to his voice carry for miles, his words igniting a spiritual fire within you. The methods of the awakening preachers were revolutionary for their time. Emotional appeals. They focused on stirring the emotions of their listeners, emphasizing personal sin, the terror of hell, and the joyous experience of salvation. Itinerant preaching. Ministers traveled from town to town, often preaching outdoors in fields because no church building could hold the crowds. This broke down traditional parish boundaries and brought the message directly to the common people. Lay exhortation. The movement encouraged ordinary people, not just ordained ministers, to share their personal conversion experiences and to preach. This empowered individuals and challenged the authority of the established clergy. The impact of the Great Awakening was profound and multifaceted. Religious pluralism and diversity. The Awakening led to the growth of new denominations, particularly Baptists and Methodists, who emphasized personal conversion and emotional piety. It also led to divisions within existing denominations between Old Lights, traditionalists who opposed the revivals, and New Lights, supporters of the revivals. This fracturing of religious authority contributed to greater religious diversity and tolerance in the colonies, as no single church could claim universal authority. Empowerment of the common person. The emphasis on individual religious experience and the ability of ordinary people to interpret scripture challenged the authority of the elite, educated clergy. It suggested that one's social status was less important than one's spiritual experience. This fostered a sense of individual worth and agency among common people, including women and even, to a limited extent, enslaved Africans, who sometimes found spiritual equality in the new churches. New educational institutions. New Light ministers, realizing the need to train their own clergy, established new colleges like Princeton Presbyterian, Brown Baptist, Rutgers Dutch Reformed, and Dartmouth Congregationalist for Native Americans. These institutions broadened educational opportunities beyond the established elites. Intercolonial unity. Whitefield's tours, in particular, created a shared experience across the diverse colonies. People from Georgia to Massachusetts listened to the same sermons, felt the same emotions, and shared a common religious language. This fostered a sense of intercolonial identity and connection, a shared culture that transcended local boundaries, subtly laying groundwork for future political unity. Challenge to authority. By encouraging individuals to question religious authority, the Awakening inadvertently encouraged them to question other forms of authority, including political authority. If common people could interpret God's word for themselves, why couldn't they also question unjust laws or unrepresentative governments? This contributed to a broader spirit of individualism and anti-authoritarianism that would fuel the coming American Revolution. The Great Awakening marked a significant cultural shift in colonial America. It moved away from a formal, intellectual religious experience towards a more personal, emotional, and democratic one. It laid the foundation for the uniquely American tradition of evangelical Protestantism and contributed to the social and intellectual climate that would eventually lead to the quest for political independence. The fires of religious revival, though seemingly apolitical, ignited a spirit of independent thought and challenge to established power that would reverberate throughout the colonies for decades to come. Our story of colonial America now arrives at a pivotal conflict, often called the French and Indian War in North America, but known globally as the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763. This was a true world war, fought across multiple continents, but its North American theater had profound and lasting consequences, fundamentally reshaping the geopolitical map of the continent and inadvertently planting the seeds of the American Revolution. For decades leading up to 1754, imperial rivalries between Great Britain and France had simmered, often erupting into smaller proxy wars in North America: King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War. Both powers sought dominance, controlling vast territories and valuable resources. The flashpoint for the French and Indian War was the Ohio River Valley. This fertile and strategically vital region, rich in furs and potential for agricultural expansion, was claimed by both the British, particularly the rapidly expanding Virginia colony, and the French, who saw it as crucial for connecting their territories in Canada with their holdings in Louisiana. In 1753–1754, the French began building a chain of forts in the Ohio Valley to assert their claim, notably Fort Duquesne, modern-day Pittsburgh. Virginia responded by sending a young, ambitious militia officer named George Washington to demand the French withdraw. Washington's ill-fated mission, including a skirmish that resulted in the death of a French diplomat, triggered the war. His subsequent defeat at Fort Necessity in 1754 marked the true start of hostilities in North America. The war involved complex alliances. British side, primarily the British Regular Army, colonial militias, and some Native American allies, most notably the Iroquois Confederacy. However, the Iroquois were often divided in their loyalties or tried to remain neutral. French side, the French Regular Army, Canadian militia, and numerous, crucially important Native American allies, including the Huron, Algonquin, Ottawa, and Delaware. The French had cultivated stronger, longer-standing trade and military alliances with these tribes than the British. The early years of the war were disastrous for the British. They suffered a humiliating defeat in 1755 when General Edward Braddock's expedition to capture Fort Duquesne was ambushed and routed by a combined French and Native American force, with Braddock himself killed. The British often struggled to adapt to the guerrilla warfare tactics employed by their French and Native American opponents in the dense American forests. Meanwhile, the Native American allies of the French, often fueled by French promises and their own desire to push back against British expansion, launched devastating raids on the exposed British colonial frontier, causing widespread terror and death. A turning point came in 1757, when William Pitt became the new British Secretary of State. Pitt dramatically altered British strategy, pouring massive resources into the North American theater. He understood that victory in North America was key to global supremacy. He sent more British regular troops, provided more supplies to the colonies, and promised financial compensation to the colonies for their war efforts. With renewed British resolve and resources, the tide began to turn. Key British victories included the capture of Louisbourg, 1758, a crucial French fortress guarding the St. Lawrence River. The capture of Fort Duquesne, 1758, which was renamed Fort Pitt, later Pittsburgh. The decisive Battle of the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec City in 1759. Both commanders, the British General James Wolfe and the French General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, were killed, but the British captured Quebec, marking a turning point in Canada. The fall of Montreal in 1760 essentially ended French power in North America. The war officially concluded with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The terms were a monumental victory for Great Britain. France ceded all of its North American territory east of the Mississippi River, including Canada and the Ohio Valley, to Great Britain. Spain, which had entered the war late on the side of France, ceded Florida to Britain. In return, France secretly ceded Louisiana to Spain. The consequences of the French and Indian War for British North America were profound. Elimination of French rivalry. Britain now stood as the undisputed imperial power in North America, removing a long-standing threat to the English colonies. This also removed a critical check on British power, leading to new policies. Increased British debt. The war was incredibly expensive, leading to a massive increase in Britain's national debt. This debt would become a primary driver of new British tax policies aimed at the colonies. Resentment between British and colonials. British officers often viewed colonial militias as undisciplined and ineffective, while colonists resented British arrogance and perceived unfair treatment. This fostered a growing sense of distinct identity between Americans and Britons. Native American dispossession. With the French gone, Native Americans in the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region lost a crucial ally and trading partner. British expansion became an even greater threat, leading to Pontiac's Rebellion, 1763, and the British issuance of the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. This infuriated land-hungry colonists. Preparation for revolution. Perhaps most ironically, by removing the French threat, Britain inadvertently removed a key reason for the colonies to rely on British protection. Coupled with new British attempts to assert greater control and raise revenue from the colonies to pay off war debts, the seeds of discontent that would blossom into revolution were firmly planted. The French and Indian War was a watershed moment. It established British dominance, but at a cost that would soon prove too high for the empire, transforming the relationship between Britain and its American colonies and setting them on an irreversible path towards independence. The dust had barely settled from the French and Indian War when Great Britain, now the undisputed power in North America, embarked on a series of policy changes that would fundamentally alter its relationship with the American colonies. These policies, driven by financial necessity and a desire for greater imperial control, were met with growing resentment and resistance, culminating in the rallying cry, "Taxation without representation." Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War came at an enormous cost. The national debt had nearly doubled, placing a heavy burden on British taxpayers. The new territories acquired in North America also required expensive administration and defense. British leaders, particularly Prime Minister George Grenville, believed it was only fair that the American colonies, which had benefited greatly from British protection during the war, should contribute to the cost of their own defense and the empire's upkeep. This led to a shift in British colonial policy, moving from a period of salutary neglect, where Britain loosely enforced its trade laws, to one of stricter control and direct taxation. The first significant measure was the Proclamation of 1763, issued by the British Crown. This proclamation forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Its aim was to prevent costly conflicts with Native Americans, like Pontiac's Rebellion, which erupted after the war, and to better control westward expansion. However, to land-hungry colonists and those who had invested in Western lands, it was seen as an arbitrary infringement on their economic opportunities and a sign that Britain prioritized Native American rights over colonial expansion. Then came a series of revenue-raising acts, each sparking escalating colonial protest. The Sugar Act 1764, this act aimed to raise revenue by cracking down on molasses smuggling and modifying duties on sugar and other imports. While it actually lowered the duty on foreign molasses, hoping to reduce smuggling and increase legal trade, it was the first act passed by Parliament specifically to raise revenue from the colonies, rather than simply regulating trade. This distinction was crucial for colonists, who saw it as an illegitimate direct tax. It primarily affected merchants, but the principle was alarming. The Stamp Act 1765, this was the real game changer. The Stamp Act imposed a direct tax on virtually all printed materials in the colonies: legal documents, commercial papers, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, and dice. These items had to bear a special stamp, indicating the tax had been paid. This tax affected everyone, from lawyers to printers to ordinary citizens. Colonial reaction. The Stamp Act ignited widespread outrage. Colonists argued that it was an internal tax, not a trade regulation, and therefore, only their own colonial assemblies, which directly represented them, had the right to levy such taxes. This was the birth of the "no taxation without representation" cry. Protests. Stamp Act Congress, October 1765, representatives from 9 colonies met in New York, issuing a declaration of rights and grievances asserting that only their own elected representatives could tax them. This was a significant step towards intercolonial unity. Boycotts. Colonial merchants organized non-importation agreements, boycotting British goods. This was a powerful economic weapon, hitting British merchants hard. Sons of Liberty. Secret societies, often led by figures like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry, emerged to organize protests, sometimes violently. They intimidated stamp distributors, destroying stamps and effigies of British officials. These groups were crucial in mobilizing popular resistance. Daughters of Liberty. Colonial women played a vital role in the boycotts, spinning their own cloth, homespun, and refusing to buy British goods, supporting the non-importation movement. The intensity of colonial resistance, particularly the economic pressure from boycotts, forced Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766. However, to save face, Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act 1766, which stated that Parliament had full authority to make laws binding the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. This was a clear assertion of British supremacy and a warning that the underlying constitutional dispute was far from resolved. The Townshend Acts 1767, the new British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, believed the colonists would accept external taxes on imported goods, rather than internal taxes like the Stamp Act. These acts imposed duties on glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea imported into the colonies. The revenue was intended to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges, making them independent of colonial assemblies, which colonists saw as undermining their control. Colonial reaction. Again, fierce protest erupted. Colonists argued that these were still taxes for revenue, not just trade regulation. New boycotts were organized, and smuggling increased. Letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, written by John Dickinson, these widely circulated essays articulated the colonial position, arguing that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies without their consent. The Townshend Acts led to a further escalation of tensions, culminating in the deployment of British troops to Boston in 1768 to maintain order and enforce customs laws. This military presence only inflamed colonial resentment. The period from 1763 to 1770 saw a dramatic shift in the relationship between Britain and its colonies. What began as a dispute over specific tax policies evolved into a fundamental constitutional debate over the nature of imperial authority, parliamentary sovereignty, and colonial rights. The phrase, "taxation without representation," encapsulated the core grievance, transforming a series of economic measures into a powerful ideological rallying cry that laid the intellectual groundwork for a complete break with the mother country. The stage was set for direct confrontation. The years following the Townshend Acts were a volatile mix of simmering resentment, fleeting periods of calm, and sudden, explosive events that drove the American colonies closer to revolution. Having established the principle of no taxation without representation, colonists now acted on it, pushing back against what they perceived as British tyranny. This chapter focuses on two pivotal incidents: the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, and the British response that finally pushed the colonies to the brink: the coercive, or intolerable, acts. The presence of British troops in Boston, intended to enforce order and customs laws, was a constant source of friction. Soldiers, often poorly paid and competing with colonists for jobs, were viewed as an occupying force. Tensions ran high. On March 5, 1770, a tense confrontation occurred. A crowd of Bostonians, agitated by economic hardship and the military presence, gathered around a lone British sentry and began to harass him. More soldiers arrived, led by Captain Thomas Preston. The crowd grew larger and more unruly, throwing snowballs, ice, and rocks. Amidst the chaos, a shot was fired, then others. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead, including Crispus Attucks, an African-American man often considered the first casualty of the Revolution. This event, quickly dubbed the Boston Massacre by propagandists like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, was not a planned attack but a tragic accident fueled by fear and misunderstanding on both sides. Yet, it was immediately spun as an unprovoked act of British brutality, effectively galvanizing anti-British sentiment. John Adams, remarkably, defended the British soldiers in court, leading to their acquittal, demonstrating the commitment to justice even amidst colonial outrage. Parliament, seeking to de-escalate tensions, eventually repealed most of the Townshend duties later in 1770, but controversially left the tax on tea. This maintained the principle of parliamentary taxation, a symbolic assertion of their authority. For a few years, a fragile calm settled over the colonies, but the fundamental dispute remained unresolved. This calm was shattered by the issue of tea. The East India Company, a vital British economic institution, was facing bankruptcy due to declining sales and a surplus of tea. To save it, Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773. This act was not a new tax. It simply allowed the East India Company to sell its tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants and significantly lowering the price of tea. The aim was to make British tea so cheap that colonists would buy it, thereby implicitly accepting the Townshend tea tax that remained. However, the colonists saw through this. They realized that accepting cheaper tea meant accepting Parliament's right to tax them without representation. It was a matter of principle, not price. Colonial merchants also feared being undercut by the powerful East India Company. Resistance coalesced around preventing the tea from being unloaded. In Boston, Governor Thomas Hutchinson insisted the tea ships be unloaded and the duty paid. This deadlock led to the dramatic events of December 16, 1773. On that cold night, a large group of Bostonians, including members of the Sons of Liberty, disguised themselves as Mohawk Native Americans. They boarded 3 tea ships. The Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, docked in Boston Harbor. Over the course of 3 hours, in front of a cheering crowd, they systematically broke open 342 chests of tea and dumped them into the harbor, destroying approximately 10,000 pounds worth of tea, millions in today's money. This act, the Boston Tea Party, was a daring and destructive act of political protest, a direct challenge to British authority. The British response was swift. punitive, and ultimately, catastrophic for colonial relations. Parliament, outraged by the destruction of private property and the defiance of imperial authority, passed a series of harsh measures in 1774, known in Britain as the Coercive Acts and in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. These acts were designed to punish Massachusetts and make an example of it. Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston to all trade until the East India Company was compensated for the destroyed tea. This was a devastating blow to Boston's economy. Massachusetts Government Act severely restricted democratic governance in Massachusetts. Town meetings were largely banned, and the governor's council was appointed by the Crown, not elected. Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes in Massachusetts to be tried in Britain or other colonies, effectively removing them from colonial justice. Quartering Act required colonists to house British soldiers in their private homes or other buildings, even without the consent of the homeowner. Quebec Act, though not directly related to Boston, passed concurrently and viewed as punitive, extended the boundaries of Quebec south to the Ohio River, recognized Catholicism, and granted special privileges to French Catholics. This infuriated Protestants in New England and those hoping for Western expansion. These acts, rather than isolating Massachusetts, had the opposite effect. They galvanized the other colonies, who recognized that if Britain could do this to Boston, it could do it to any of them. The Intolerable Acts became a call to unity. In response, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia was absent, met in Philadelphia in September 1774 for the First Continental Congress. They condemned the Intolerable Acts, called for a complete boycott of British goods, and urged colonies to form militias and prepare for armed resistance. They also drafted a petition to King George III, outlining their grievances. The escalation was now undeniable. From Stamp Act protests to the Boston Massacre, and now the Boston Tea Party and the Intolerable Acts, each action and reaction had narrowed the path to reconciliation. The British, desperate to assert control, had instead pushed the colonies towards a shared identity of grievance and a willingness to defy imperial authority. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, a fight not just for rights, but for self-determination. The atmosphere in Massachusetts in early 1775 was thick with tension, a powder keg waiting for a spark. The British Intolerable Acts had solidified colonial resolve, and the First Continental Congress had called for military preparedness. Both sides understood that open conflict was increasingly likely. This chapter takes us to the fateful dawn of April 19, 1775, the day the shot heard round the world was fired, marking the undisputed beginning of the American Revolutionary War at Lexington and Concord. Massachusetts, particularly Boston, was a hotbed of patriot activity. Royal Governor-General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in North America, occupied Boston with several thousand troops. His mission was to enforce British authority, suppress dissent, and, critically, to seize colonial military supplies that were being stockpiled in various towns outside Boston. The colonists, for their part, were organized. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress, an extra-legal body, had formed and was actively preparing for conflict. Militias, comprised of ordinary citizens ready to fight at a moment's notice, thus dubbed Minutemen, were training and storing weapons and gunpowder in towns like Concord. Figures like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, vocal patriot leaders, were also targets for arrest by British authorities. Gage received secret orders from London to assert control and seize colonial military stores. He planned a clandestine night march to Concord, about 20 miles west of Boston, where a major cache of arms and ammunition was stored. His secondary objective was to capture Adams and Hancock, who were believed to be staying in Lexington, on the way to Concord. However, Gage's plans were not as secret as he hoped. The Sons of Liberty had an effective intelligence network. On the night of April 18, 1775, patriots in Boston observed unusual British troop movements. Alert riders were immediately dispatched to warn the countryside. The most famous of these was Paul Revere, along with William Dawes and later Drive Samuel Prescott. Revere and Dawes took different routes to avoid detection. Revere's ride through Medford and Lexington was famously commemorated by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem. They rode through the night, knocking on doors, shouting their warning, "The British are coming." Though likely they would have said, "The regulars are coming," as colonists still considered themselves British. The warnings worked. By the time the British column of about 700 elite grenadier and light infantry, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, marched out of Boston just after midnight on April 19. The alarm had spread. Church bells rang, drums beat, and local militias began to muster. At dawn, as the British column marched into the town of Lexington, they found about 70 armed colonial militiamen, led by Captain John Parker, lined up on the village green. These were not a battle-hardened army, but local farmers, craftsmen, and laborers, standing their ground. What happened next is still debated. Someone fired a shot. It is unknown who fired first, whether a nervous British soldier, a colonial militiaman from behind a wall, or an accidental discharge. But that single, pivotal shot became the shot heard round the world, igniting a global conflict. The British regulars, far outnumbering the militia, immediately opened fire. 8 militiamen were killed, and 10 wounded. The colonial force, vastly outmatched, quickly dispersed. The British cheered, believing they had easily routed the rebels. They then continued their march to Concord. Upon reaching Concord, the British found that most of the colonial arms and provisions had already been moved or hidden. They set about destroying what little remained, including burning some wooden gun carriages. As smoke rose from the town, colonial militiamen, now numbering several hundred and reinforced from surrounding towns, gathered on a ridge overlooking the North Bridge in Concord. The British sentries at the bridge fired upon the approaching militia. The militia, under Major John Buttrick, returned fire, this time with greater effect. The British suffered casualties and retreated back towards the town center. This brief skirmish at the North Bridge was the first instance of American forces successfully engaging and driving back British regulars. The British then began their march back to Boston, a retreat that quickly turned into a living nightmare. By now, thousands of colonial militiamen from surrounding towns had converged, alerted by the riders and the sounds of battle. Using guerrilla tactics, they lined the road from Concord to Lexington and then all the way to Boston, hiding behind trees, stone walls, and houses, firing continuously on the exposed British column. The British, exhausted from their all-night march, running low on ammunition, and hampered by their bright red uniforms, were sitting targets. They suffered heavy casualties. Only the timely arrival of British reinforcements under Lord Percy saved them from complete annihilation. By the time the battered British forces stumbled back into Boston, they had suffered over 270 casualties killed, wounded, or missing compared to about 90 for the colonists. Lexington and Concord were not major battles in terms of scale, but their significance was immense. Start of the war. They marked the point of no return. Armed conflict had begun, transforming a political dispute into a military one. Colonial confidence. The Patriots, though initially dispersed at Lexington, proved at Concord and during the retreat that they could stand up to and inflict heavy losses on the seemingly invincible British regular army. This boosted colonial morale, mobilization. News of the fighting spread rapidly throughout the colonies, galvanizing support for the Patriot cause and leading to the immediate mobilization of militias across New England, effectively besieging the British in Boston. The shot heard round the world at Lexington was more than a single bullet. It was the definitive sound of a new nation being forged in fire, a people determined to fight for their rights and, increasingly, for their independence. The American Revolution had begun. The battles of Lexington and Concord had ignited armed conflict, but the American colonies were not yet fighting for independence. Most colonists, even after the bloodshed, still saw themselves as loyal subjects of the British Crown, merely seeking a redress of grievances and a restoration of their rights as Englishmen. The journey from armed rebellion to a complete break with the mother country was a complex one, driven by escalating British actions, influential writings, and profound philosophical arguments that would culminate in the Declaration of Independence. After Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May 1775. This body became the de facto governing body of the rebellious colonies. While some delegates, like John Adams, already believed independence was inevitable, many others, particularly from the middle and southern colonies, still hoped for reconciliation. They sent the Olive Branch petition to King George III in July 1775, a final plea for peace and a return to former harmony. The king, however, refused to even read it, declaring the colonies in open rebellion. This rejection, coupled with increasingly harsh British measures, including the hiring of Hessian mercenaries, German soldiers, to fight against the colonists, and the Royal Navy blockading American ports, began to push public opinion towards independence. A pivotal moment in shifting colonial sentiment was the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in January 1776. Paine, a recent immigrant from England, wrote in clear, accessible language, directly challenging the institution of monarchy and advocating for republican government. He argued that King George III was a royal brute, and that monarchy itself was an illegitimate form of government. He passionately articulated the absurdity of a continent being governed by an island. He laid out the economic and political advantages of independence, making a compelling case for a completely new form of government based on popular sovereignty. Common Sense sold hundreds of thousands of copies and was read aloud in taverns and meetinghouses across the colonies, profoundly influencing ordinary people and moving many from loyalty to the crown to a desire for complete separation. By the spring of 1776, momentum for independence was building. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution in the Continental Congress declaring that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Recognizing the monumental nature of this decision, Congress appointed a committee of 5 to draft a formal declaration. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert R. Livingston of New York. Jefferson, known for his eloquent prose, was chosen to be the primary author. Jefferson drafted the Declaration in just a few weeks, drawing heavily on Enlightenment political philosophy, particularly the ideas of John Locke. Locke, an English philosopher, had articulated the concept of natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and the idea of a social contract between the government and the governed. According to Locke, governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the people, and if a government becomes destructive of the people's rights, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. The Declaration of Independence, adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4, 1776, is divided into several key parts. Preamble. This is the most famous section, outlining the philosophical justification for independence. It asserts that all men are created equal, and are endowed with certain, unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It states that governments are instituted to secure these rights, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that when a government becomes destructive of these ends, the people have a right to alter or to abolish it. This was a revolutionary statement, applying Enlightenment ideals directly to political action. List of grievances. This long section details a litany of complaints against King George III and Parliament, providing specific examples of British abuses. These included taxation without consent, e.g., Stamp Act, Townshend Acts, quartering of troops, denial of trial by jury, cutting off trade, maintaining standing armies in peacetime, repealing colonial laws, inciting domestic insurrections, referring to Native American attacks and enslaved persons joining British forces. The king's refusal to redress these grievances, proving his tyrannical intent. Formal Declaration of Independence. This final section formally declares the 13 colonies to be free and independent states, absolved of all allegiance to the British Crown, and possessing the full powers of independent nations to wage war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, etc. The declaration was a bold and audacious act. The men who signed it were committing treason in the eyes of the British Crown, risking their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. It was a statement of profound ideals, but also a pragmatic appeal for foreign aid, particularly from France, which would be crucial to winning the war. It's important to acknowledge the inherent tension and hypocrisy within the Declaration's soaring ideals. While proclaiming, all men are created equal, the authors, many of whom were slaveholders, did not extend these rights to enslaved Africans. Jefferson's original draft included a strong condemnation of the slave trade, but this was removed by Congress to ensure unanimous support from Southern colonies. This moral contradiction would haunt the nation for generations. Nevertheless, the Declaration of Independence was a transformative document. It articulated the fundamental principles of American democracy, popular sovereignty, natural rights, and the right of revolution when government becomes tyrannical. It provided a moral and philosophical justification for the Revolutionary War, transforming it from a colonial rebellion into a struggle for universal human rights. It was not merely a declaration of separation, but a blueprint for a new form of government and a beacon for liberty movements around the world. The act of signing it on July 4, 1776, sealed the fate of the colonies and propelled them onto an irreversible path toward becoming an independent nation. With the Declaration of Independence, the American colonies formally severed ties with Great Britain, but the real work, and the ultimate trial, lay ahead, winning the war against the most powerful empire in the world and then forging a new, unified nation out of disparate states. This final chapter brings us to the cusp of the 19th century, detailing the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, the struggles of the Articles of Confederation, and the pivotal creation of the United States Constitution. The Revolutionary War, which had begun in 1775, was a long, arduous, and often desperate struggle. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, faced immense challenges: chronic shortages of supplies, lack of consistent funding, short enlistments, and a powerful, professional British army. Washington's leadership, his ability to keep the army together through brutal winters like Valley Forge, and his strategic prowess were indispensable. Key turning points in the war included: Battle of Saratoga, 1777. This decisive American victory in upstate New York over a large British force was crucial. It convinced France, a long-standing rival of Britain, to formally ally with the Americans. French financial aid, military supplies, and crucially, naval support, transformed the war from a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. French alliance, 1778. The entry of France, followed by Spain and the Netherlands, into the war significantly stretched British resources and attention, forcing them to fight on multiple fronts globally. Battle of Yorktown, 1781. The final major battle. A combined American and French force, with critical French naval blockades preventing British escape or reinforcement, trapped and besieged General Cornwallis's British army at Yorktown, Virginia. Cornwallis was forced to surrender, effectively ending major fighting in the war. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally ended the Revolutionary War. Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States, granted them vast territory stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, and south to Florida. It was a stunning diplomatic victory for the fledgling nation. With independence secured, the challenge shifted from winning a war to building a nation. The first governing document of the United States was the Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781 during the war. It reflected the deep-seated fear of a powerful central government, a reaction to their experience with British tyranny. Weaknesses of the Articles. Weak central government. The Articles created a loose league of friendship among the states, not a strong national government. Congress had little real power. No power to tax. Congress could only request money from the states, which often refused. This led to chronic financial instability, inability to pay war debts, and a worthless national currency. No executive or judiciary. There was no president to enforce laws and no national court system to interpret them. Difficulty in passing laws. 9 of 13 states were required to pass major legislation, making it difficult to get anything done. Unanimous consent for amendments. Amending the Articles required the consent of all 13 states, making reform virtually impossible. Interstate disputes. States often squabbled over trade, land, and currency, with no strong national authority to mediate. The weaknesses of the Articles became painfully evident in the years following the war. The nation faced economic depression, internal unrest, and a lack of respect from foreign powers. The most alarming incident was Shays' Rebellion, 1786-1787, in Massachusetts, where indebted farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, rebelled against foreclosures and high taxes. The national government was too weak to effectively suppress the rebellion, which ultimately had to be put down by the Massachusetts state militia. This event underscored the urgent need for a stronger national government capable of maintaining order and protecting property. Recognizing the crisis, prominent leaders like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton advocated for a convention to revise the Articles. In May 1787, delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island notably abstained, met in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Instead of merely revising the Articles, the delegates, largely driven by Madison's vision, decided to scrap them entirely and draft a completely new framework of government. The convention was a remarkable exercise in compromise and political ingenuity. Key debates included representation. Large states favored the Virginia Plan, proportional representation based on population, while small states favored the New Jersey Plan, equal representation for each state. The Great Compromise, Connecticut Compromise, resolved this by creating a bicameral legislature. The House of Representatives proportional representation and the Senate equal representation, 2 senators per state. Slavery. The issue of slavery was deeply divisive. Southern states wanted enslaved people counted for representation but not for taxation, while northern states argued the opposite. The 3/5 compromise settled this, counting each enslaved person as 3/5 of a free person for both representation and taxation. The convention also agreed to allow the slave trade to continue until 1808. These compromises preserved the Union but enshrined slavery in the nation's foundational document, setting the stage for future conflict. Executive power. Debates over the powers and selection of the president. Checks and balances, separation of powers. The framers meticulously designed a system with 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, judicial, each with distinct powers and the ability to limit the others, to prevent the concentration of power and safeguard liberty. After 4 months of intense debate and compromise, the United States Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787. It established a strong federal government with enumerated powers, while reserving other powers to the states. The Constitution then had to be ratified by the states. This led to a fierce national debate between Federalists, supporters of the Constitution, e.g., James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, who wrote the Federalist Papers. They argued for a strong national government to ensure stability, economic prosperity, and national defense. Anti-Federalists, opponents of the Constitution, e.g., Patrick Henry, George Mason. They feared a powerful central government would erode states' rights and individual liberties, potentially leading to tyranny. They demanded a Bill of Rights to protect individual freedoms. To secure ratification, the Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights. With this assurance, the Constitution was eventually ratified by all 13 states. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments guaranteeing fundamental rights like freedom of speech, religion, and assembly, and protecting against government overreach, was added in 1791. With the ratification of the Constitution and the election of George Washington as the first president in 1789, the United States of America entered a new era. From its tenuous beginnings as a collection of struggling colonies to a new nation grappling with its identity and governing principles, America had crossed a momentous threshold. The challenges were immense: economic stability, Native American relations, internal divisions, and the persistent specter of slavery. But the foundation for a durable republic, forged in revolution and constitutional debate, had been laid, bringing us to the very edge of the 19th century and the threshold of a new chapter in American history.